All right. We're going to be reading from Esperanza Rising, and we're in the first chapter, which is called Las Uvas, the grapes. We're about halfway through the chapter. Tea was ready in Papa's study, and so was Abuelita. Come, mi nieta, my granddaughter, said Abuelita, holding up yarn and crochet hooks. I am starting a new blanket, and I will teach you the zigzag. Esperanza's grandmother, whom everyone called Abuelita, lived with them and was a smaller, older, more wrinkled version of Mama. She looked very distinguished, wearing a respectable black dress, the same gold loops she wore in her ears every day, and her white hair pulled back into a bun at the nape of her neck. But Esperanza loved her more for her capricious ways than for her propriety. Abuelita might host a group of ladies for a formal tea in the afternoon, then when they had gone, be found wandering barefoot in the grapes with a book in her hand, quoting poetry to the birds. Although some things were always the same with Abuelita, a lace-edged handkerchief peeking out from beneath the sleeve of her dress. So sometimes women in the olden days would stuff a handkerchief in their sleeve, and you'd see it kind of poking out, and then they could pull it out and, gently use the handkerchief. That was a very common thing and a very proper thing. Although some things were always the same with Abuelita, a lace-edged handkerchief peeking out from beneath the sleeve of her dress, others were surprising: a flower in her hair, a beautiful stone in her pocket, or a philosophical saying salted into her conversation. When Abuelita walked into a room, everyone scrambled to make her comfortable. Even Papa would give up his chair for her. Esperanza complained, "Must we always crochet to take our minds off worry?" She sat next to her grandmother anyway, smelling her ever-present aroma of garlic, face powder, and peppermint. "What happened to your finger?" asked Abuelita. "A big thorn," said Esperanza. Abuelita nodded and said thoughtfully, "No hay rosa sin espinas." There is no rose without thorns. Esperanza smiled, knowing that Abuelita wasn't talking about flowers at all, but that there was no life without difficulties. She watched the silver crochet needle dance back and forth in her grandmother's hand. When a strand of her hair fell into her lap, Abuelita picked it up and held it against the yarn and stitched it into the blanket. "Esperanza, in this way my love and good wishes will always be in the blanket forever. Now watch. 10 stitches up to the top of the mountain, add 1 stitch, 9 stitches down to the bottom of the valley, skip 1. Esperanza picked up her own crochet needle and copied Abuelita's movements, and then looked at her own crocheting. The tops of the mountains were lopsided, and the bottoms of her valleys were all bunched up. Abuelita smiled, reached over, and pulled the yarn, unraveling all of Esperanza's rows. "Do not be afraid to start over," she said. That's a great quote right there. That's kind of the theme of this whole book. Don't be afraid to start over. Bad things are going to happen in your life, and you have to get up, dust yourself off, and start over. "Do not be afraid to start over," she said. Esperanza sighed and began again with 10 stitches. Softly humming, Hortensia the housekeeper came in with a plate of small sandwiches. She offered one to Mama. "No, thank you," said Mama. Hortensia set the tray down and brought a shawl and wrapped it protectively around Mama's shoulders. Esperanza couldn't remember a time when Hortensia had not taken care of them. She was a Zapotec India from Oaxaca, with a short, solid figure and blue-black hair in a braid down her back. Esperanza watched the 2 women look out into the dark and couldn't help but think that Hortensia was almost the opposite of Mama. "Don't worry so much," said Hortensia. "Alfonso and Miguel will find him." Alfonso, Hortensia's husband, was el jefe, the boss, of all the field workers, and Papa's compañero, his close friend and companion. He had the same dark skin and small stature as Hortensia, and Esperanza thought his round eyes, long eyelids, and droopy mustache made him look like a forlorn puppy. He was anything but sad, though. He loved the land, as Papa did, and it had been the two of them working side by side who had resurrected the neglected rose garden that had been in the family for generations. Alfonso's brother worked in the United States, so Alfonso always talked about going there someday, but he stayed in Mexico because of his attachment to Papa and El Rancho de las Rosas. Miguel was Alfonso and Hortensia's son, and he and Esperanza had played together since they were babies. At 16, he was already taller than both of his parents. He had their dark skin and Alfonso's big sleepy eyes and thick eyebrows that Esperanza always thought would grow into one. But it was true that he knew the farthest reaches of the ranch better than anyone. Since Miguel was a young boy, Papa had taken him to parts of the property that even Esperanza and Mama had never seen. When she was younger, Esperanza used to complain, "Why does he always get to go and not me?" Papa would say, "Because he knows how to fix things, and he is learning his job." Miguel would look at her, and before riding off with Papa, he would give her a taunting smile. But what Papa said was true, too. Miguel had patience and quiet strength and could figure out how to fix anything, plows and tractors, especially anything with a motor. Several years ago, when Esperanza was still a young girl, Mama and Papa had been discussing boys from good families whom Esperanza should meet someday. She couldn't imagine being matched with someone she had never met, so she announced, "I am going to marry Miguel." Mama had laughed at her and said, "You will feel differently as you get older." "No, I won't," Esperanza said stubbornly. But now that she was a young woman, she understood that Miguel was the housekeeper's son, and she was the ranch owner's daughter, and between them ran a deep river. Esperanza stood on one side, and Miguel stood on the other, and the river could never be crossed. In a moment of self-importance, Esperanza had told all of this to Miguel. Since then, he had spoken only a few words to her, because she hurt his feelings, right? She's telling him, "I'm wealthy, you're poor. We are on either sides of a river that we cannot cross." Right? And that's going to hurt his feelings. He's going to feel bad about that. In a moment of self-importance, Esperanza had told all of this to Miguel. Since then, he had spoken only a few words to her. When their paths crossed, he nodded and said politely, "Mi reina," my queen, but nothing more. There was no teasing or laughing or talking about every little thing. Esperanza pretended not to care, though she secretly wished that she had never told Miguel about the river. Distracted, Mama paced at the window, each step making a hollow tapping sound on the tile floor. Hortensia lit the lamps. The minutes passed into hours. "I hear riders," said Mama, and she ran for the door. But it was only Tio Luis and Tio Marco, Papa's older stepbrothers. Tio Luis was the bank president, and Tio Marco was the mayor of the town. Esperanza didn't care how important they were, because she did not like them. They were serious and gloomy, and they always held their chins too high. Tio Luis was the eldest, and Tio Marco, who was a few years younger and not as smart, always followed his older brother's lead, like un burro, a donkey. Even though Tio Marco was the mayor, he did everything Tio Luis told him to do. They were both tall and skinny, with tiny mustaches and white beards just on the tips of their chins. Esperanza could tell that Mama did not like them either, but she was always polite because they were Papa's family. Mama had even hosted parties for Tio Marco when he ran for mayor. Neither had ever married, and Papa said it was because they loved money and power more than people. Esperanza thought it was because they looked like two underfed billy goats. "Ramona," said Tio Luis, "we may have bad news. One of the vaqueros brought this to us." He handed Mama Papa's silver belt buckle. the only one of its kind, engraved with the brand of the ranch. Mamma's face whitened. She examined it, turning it over and over in her hand. It may mean nothing, she said. Then, ignoring them, she turned toward the window and began pacing again, still clutching the belt buckle. "We will wait with you in your time of need," said Tia Luis. And as he passed Esperanza, he patted her shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. Esperanza stared after him. In her entire life, she couldn't remember him ever touching her. Her uncles were not like those of her friends. They never spoke to her, played, or even teased her. In fact, they acted as if she didn't exist at all. And for that reason, Tia Luis's sudden kindness made her shiver with fear for Papa. Abuelita and Hortensia began lighting candles and saying prayers for the men's safe return. Mamma, with her arms hugging her chest, swayed back and forth at the window, never taking her eyes from the darkness. They tried to pass the time with small talk, but their words dwindled into silence. Every sound of the house seemed magnified. The clock ticking, someone coughing, the clink of a teacup. Esperanza struggled with her stitches. She tried to think about the fiesta and all the presents she would receive tomorrow. She tried to think of bouquets of roses and baskets of grapes on every table. She tried to think of Marisol and the other girls giggling and telling stories. But those thoughts would only stay in her mind for a moment before transforming into worry, because she couldn't ignore the throbbing soreness in her thumb where the thorn had left its unlucky mark. It wasn't until the candelabra held nothing but short stubs of tallow that Mamma finally said, "I see a lantern. Someone is coming." They hurried to the courtyard and watched a distant light, a small beacon of hope swaying in the darkness. The wagon came into view. Alfonso held the reins and Miguel the lantern. When the wagon stopped, Esperanza could see a body and back completely covered with a blanket. "Where's Papa?" she cried. Miguel hung his head. Alfonso didn't say a word, but the tears running down his round cheeks confirmed the worst. Mamma fainted. Abuelita and Hortensia ran to her side. Esperanza felt her heart drop. A noise came from her mouth, and slowly, her first breath of grief grew into a tormented cry. She fell to her knees and sank into a dark hole of despair and disbelief. And we will stop right there. So now her dad is gone. And now there's going to be a problem because he's a wealthy landowner and now he's not around anymore. And there's going to be a question about who is going to take care of the ranch and who actually owns the ranch. So we will stop right there.